Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this important event. As we know, hate speech has no universal definition, but it is a universal problem. And I want to offer my thoughts about how it hurts journalists and journalism and what we can do about it. Until last year, I spent almost a decade working as the director of the International News Safety Institute, where I supported my colleagues predominantly in matters of physical safety, coordinating a network of major news organisations where we shared information to help keep our colleagues safe in war zones and other hostile environments. These were places where the front lines of fighting might shift, where the threats to their security were generally tangible, places where journalists could take physical flak jackets and first aid kits, where risk assessments would tell them where to go and where not to go. But in the last few years, we've seen these front lines change. Yes, physical hostile environments, be they war, disaster, disease or disorder, still exist, unfortunately. But the most frequent wars we as journalists are having to face are online. The web has been weaponised and it has been turned against us. We are seeing world leaders undermining journalism by misrepresenting legitimate media as fake news and encouraging attacks on our profession. We hear of troll armies who try to drown out our colleagues' voices and extremists who viralise their violence in the dark web. We hear of fake accounts that purport to be real journalists and spout disinformation and hatred to ruin people's reputations. In this unprecedented year, we've seen a rise in hate speech, one UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has expressed concern about. And as the head of the Ethical Journalism Network, I have seen COVID-19 used as a cloak by country governments to crack down on press freedom, often through the lens of hate speech, the proliferation of hateful content and populist rhetoric that has created division and incited violence against different groups of people. Be in no doubt, this is an attack on press freedom, something that compromises our ability to do our jobs, to report freely, to undertake our vital roles in the underpinning of democracy. Today I want to share with you some of my insights into how hate speech and harmful content is hurting journalists and journalism, how it impacts those who are most vulnerable and marginalised in and by the media, and how we, as individuals, organisations and an international community can work to counter hate speech and in turn strive towards greater diversity in our newsrooms and news content. But firstly, I'd like to acknowledge a couple of things. Much of what I share today will be formulated from my insights and thoughts after 20 years in the industry, working as a journalist, media and gender safety expert, and also as a survivor of sexual assault. I recognise that as a university-educated white woman, I have a degree of privilege and a platform many of my colleagues do not. I'm talking about colleagues who are marginalised by a cis-male, white, university-educated, straight industry. I'm talking about those whose positions are more vulnerable, whose perspectives are heard less, whose voices are quietened because they do not hold the power. It's those colleagues who are by and large immediately impacted by the effects of hate speech and harmful content online, and those colleagues who, by natures of the structure of our industry, often shine a light on minority groups and marginalised people who bear the brunt of virtual vitriol. But where they suffer, I believe we all do. I want to focus for a few minutes on the gendered aspect of online harassment because this is a perspective I can best bring to this conversation. Several years ago, the UK think tank Demos estimated that women journalists were 3 times more likely to experience harassment on Twitter than their male colleagues. I've been working to support those facing online harassment for the best part of a decade, and in all that time I've been working in this field, most of the virtual abuse directed at my female colleagues has been sexualised. I've heard of colleagues threatened with rape, women whose children have been targeted, who have had their personal details shared online, those who have been the victim of fake accounts spreading salacious and false details about their sex lives, women who have had their heads superimposed onto naked bodies. And all of this exists online in a virtual world where abusers are able to hide behind anonymity. Imagine what it feels like when you turn on your phone early in the hours of the morning, when you're not quite awake or you're not quite in your work mindset, and you're hit by a barrage of this kind of abuse. It can be devastating. The psychological toll has not yet been studied in detail, but I am convinced it is massive. And the situation appears to be deteriorating further in the context of events this year. It's worth noting that in the last week or so, a new study has been launched jointly by UNESCO and the International Centre for Journalists, looking at the incidence and the impact of online violence against women journalists and effective measures to tackle the problem in the context of COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement. I'd encourage you all to seek out that study, the link to which is available on the conference website. But to the impacts that we know. A study done by the International Women's Media Foundation and Trollbusters in 2017 found that 70% of women journalists who responded to the survey had been attacked online. Nearly 2/3 of women journalists said they considered leaving the profession because of online threats and attacks. Let's stop for a moment to consider what this means. Women, who are already the minority in many newsrooms and in our news content, are now so under attack when they dare to speak out that they are considering giving up these spaces where they share their voices and amplify the experiences of others. We know there are some subject areas that seem to incur the wrath of the trolls and online haters more. Subjects like climate change, reproductive rights, gaming, trans rights, migration, sport, when it's reported by women. But sometimes it's just the simple fact a woman speaks that sparks online hatred and misogyny. So what does that mean for media plurality, for the work we do? Let me share some more statistics. These are from the Council of Europe in 2017, which looked at the impact of online abuse. 31% toned down coverage of certain stories, 15% drop the story, 23% don't cover certain stories. If journalists are unable to write about stories and they're unable to share their own experiences, we become less and less open, less and less able to be inclusive, less and less promoting of media plurality. But there's another statistic too in this report that worries me. 57% do not report that they have been the targets of online violence. Why is this the case? Here's my take on it from years working in an industry where people are still concerned about speaking safely about a range of issues, including gendered harassment, mental health, and where people do not feel safe if they are already marginalised. The simple fact is that that our news industry is still not an inclusive place, one where people feel able to come forward and report their experiences. In an environment where they are already the other, in inverted commas, it might make them be seen as a liability. In an environment where job security is not strong, whereas really their difference from the status quo should be embraced as bringing more perspective and diversity. Another reason for the lack of reporting is that because these attacks exist in the virtual world, they're sometimes seen of as less serious than if they existed in real life. And it's also because people have no faith in the systems in place, be that in their newsrooms or in their own country's law enforcement, to actually secure any kind of justice for them, and because they know or suspect that they'll be forced to relive the traumas of the online hatred if they do try to pursue any legal measures. But let's think again what happens if this is allowed to continue. We get to a situation where we lose marginalised voices as reporters and in our reporting, because these same people tend also to write about others in society who are vulnerable. We are sending a message to those who want to silence people through harmful content and hate speech that this form of censoring is acceptable. Of course it's not. So what can we do about it from the perspective of the individual, newsrooms and institutions? Firstly, we need to recognise this for what it is. It is a direct threat to press freedom and media plurality. We need to stop normalising the abnormal, and we need to abnormalise the normal. We know that there is a risk of online threats and abuse spilling over into the real world. We've seen this in incidences such as the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, who was targeted online before she was murdered. We also know the consequences of censorship and of women leaving the industry of allowing this to continue. As individuals, all of this can seem extremely isolating when it happens. However, virtual violence does not exist in a vacuum, neither in the way it attacks its victims or in the way it viralizes. Those who suffer need solidarity. They need someone they can trust to speak with, but also someone who can take charge of their social media if things get really tough. They need the support of their newsrooms to ensure they've taken all the measures possible to mitigate their risks of exposure, to lock down their personal details, to manage the information they have online about themselves. Newsrooms need to recognise this for the risk it is, as I've said. So when they send people to war zones, they prepare them as they provide them with the relevant support, be that physical, digital or psychological, and they do risk assessments. I'd like to see the same in this online war scenario. At this point, I'd like to share some advice from a colleague of mine, Mary Hamilton, the former communities editor of The Guardian. Her advice is for newsrooms, and it was compiled in 2017, but it's still relevant today. Firstly, anticipate campaigns targeting journalists, the organisation and the concept of reporting. Secondly, prepare for the worst attacks. Thirdly, commission diverse writers on diverse topics. Fourthly, design systems and tools to minimise harm. And finally, take this seriously throughout the whole organisation. And those tips by Mary Hamilton offer newsrooms to help counter and understand the impact and effects of online harassment. I want to turn now to another area of accountability. As the head of the Ethical Journalism Network, I spend a lot of time thinking about how we cannot create ethical journalism content unless we have the right systems to enable our newsrooms to allow inclusive, accountable cultures to thrive. I think it's important to recognise that accountability in journalism means several things. Firstly, that we hold those in power to account. Secondly, we are accountable to our audiences. And thirdly, we hold ourselves to account. I don't think we can succeed at any of these unless we consider them all. But what does this have to do with hate speech and harmful content, you might ask? A few years ago at the Ethical Journalism Network, we created a 5-point test for journalists when dealing with hate speech. History shows us that if left unchecked, the consequences of hate speech can be devastating. Even recent history has shown that hate speech has been directed against minority groups during this pandemic as a form of scapegoating, stereotyping, stigmatising and shaming. Our 5-point test asked journalists not only to consider what was being said and who was saying it, but the intent of the words too. So these are the 5 points. The first is status of the speaker. Should they be listened to or ignored? The second is the reach of the speech, where it's said, and is it repeated? The third is the objective of the speech. How does it benefit the speaker? Is it intended to hurt other people? The fourth is content and form. Is the speech, the content of the speech and the form of the speech dangerous, and does it incite violence? And the fifth one is the context, so the political, social and economic context within which these words are being said. So that was our 5-point plan for journalists to help them understand, identify and counter hate speech in the news. And back to that idea of accountability, as I mentioned before. What we're seeing increasingly is people in power directing hateful speech against others, increasing the division in effect between those they regard as belonging to their own group and those they regard as the other. This is a slippery slope towards autocracy and away from democracy. In many ways, we as journalists are the gatekeepers. It's our responsibility as journalists to recognise the influence we have and the roles and responsibilities we play in shaping public opinion. It's up to us to call out and flag harmful, discriminatory, racist and misogynist content directed at us and at others. It's up to us to be aware of the impact, both in our industries and in society at large, of hate speech and the devastating consequences for all of us when that escalates. Only then can we ensure that we hear from and hear about the voices that will make our industry more diverse and more inclusive. Thank you.